The stories of Pearl Buck are compelling and intriguing, and when you attempt to discuss the essence of the stories themselves in a short period of time, hopefully the words will encourage you to go to the text so that you can immerse yourself in her words and so that you can study the subtleties of psychological insights she offers, and so that you can mouth and participate in a dialogue that explores the psychological characters of her fiction. Our first today, this afternoon, or the second speaker this evening, let me go back. The first speaker in the second half of this session will be Mr. Jeff Cupp, who will discuss the story, The Commander and the Commissar.
Well, the book, The 14 Stories, was first published in 1961. The events that are in this story, the Commander and the Commissar, could have happened anywhere from the early 1950s up to when it was published in 1961. This means that the president could have been, for the United States, anybody from Harry Truman to Eisenhower to Kennedy, but it was most likely Eisenhower. China's leader during this whole time was, of course, the great Mao. Now, I want to take some time and mix in some facts about China and Tibet that would give you some historical reference to what is going on here in this story. China is the largest of all the Asian countries. It occupies nearly the entire land mass of Asia. And I kind of did a little map here that maybe you can kind of see the breadth of it, but it stretches 3,100 miles from the east to the west and 3,400 miles from the north to the south. It has a land border of 12,400 miles and a coast of 8,700 miles. It covers an area of over 3.5 million square miles. That's like 1/4 of all the earth on Earth, and so it's huge. And that goes into why the Chinese are the way they are, I suppose. Now, not only is the land huge, but the population is huge also. More than 20% of all of mankind is Chinese. As early as 800 BC, China had already had a population of over 13 million people. In the early 1980s, it had already surpassed the 1 billion mark. China also has a rich, long history of dynastic rulers that lasted clear through 1911. It has more than 4,000 years of recorded history. If you compare that to the United States, who, if we use our colonial period, can go back maybe 400 years, China has 10 times more than that. Beginning in the mid-1980s, China lost much of her sovereignty to these various Western European powers. It was this weakness that led to the Chinese communists and their power. After many years of internal strife, the Chinese communists finally wrestled power away from Chiang Kai-shek in 1949, and he had to retreat, of course, to the island of Taiwan. It was shortly after this that China decided that they were going to reassert themselves over Tibet. And of course, Mao goes on to be Chinese leader until his death in 1976. The other area that we're talking about is going to be Tibet. Now, Tibet sometimes is referred to as the roof of the world, and that's mainly because of its high plain that it's on. In fact, Mount Everest is in that territory, and Mount Everest is like over 29,000 feet tall. Tibet is situated down the south part of China. You can see on the map there. It occupies almost 500,000 square miles with a population of only 3 million, but that was in 1953. At that time, 20% of the Tibetan population were monks. Now, there was a legend that the Tibetan people originated from the union of a monkey and a female demon. And I don't think that's too flattering, so I'm not really sure where this legend originated. In 1949, Tibet was described as nominally a Chinese dependency, but independent in practice. Tibet was the only country besides the Vatican City that was entirely under ecclesiastical control. The country was ruled by Linger Lamut Tanch, I believe is how you would say that, but he's more easily known as the 14th Dalai Lama. In 1950, when China decided to reassert its presence over Tibet, they announced that they were going to liberate Tibet by force. By 1959, the Dalai Lama was forced into exile, and he has been, and since 1965, Tibet has basically been under the control of China. It was in the midst of this that Pearl Buck wrote The Commander and the Commissar. Now, going over the major characters in this novel, or this short story, there's really only two, the Commander and the Commissar. Okay. Both of these characters were volunteered as youths to join the Communist Army. They were looking for a few good men. The commander was described as the strongest and the most handsome of these 23 boys that were taken out of this particular village. He had a soft heart. He loved people, especially his own men, who he considered his children. In fact, the only love that he had ever known was the love that he had felt for his men. He was emotional and even openly wept for his mother when he was drafted. However, he was somewhat of a simple-minded person. In complete contrast to the commander was the commissar. Now, in case you haven't read the story yet, a commissar in this story is basically, he's an ideological officer. He makes sure that the people, the commander, follow the party line and do what they're supposed to be doing as far as the communist world is concerned. Now, while the commander was very strong and handsome, the commissar was very frail in his body, but he was quick in his mind. As a small boy, when the people came in to draft, they were going to leave him behind, but he started crying, saying how much he had already read about Marx and Lenin and Mao. And it was because of this that he was taken with the other boys. But while they were shipped off to, I guess, what was a boot camp, he was sent off to the political school. His superiors saw him as suave and obedient, but his inferiors saw him as being arrogant and a tyrant. Now, some specific events to move the story along. As I had mentioned, the commander and the commissar, his name was Yang Fu-ping, and the commander's friend, Cao Li, along with 20 other boys from this village, were drafted into the Communist Army. Now, after 15 years of service, this commander was being rewarded by being given this mission to go to Tibet. Now, the mission was to proceed with his battalion of 1,000 men to this unnamed military outpost out in Tibet and to convoy to them supplies and their pay, basically. And the only catch to the whole mission was that he had to take this commissar along with him. The commissar was coming along to act as an interpreter because he supposedly knew the language. So if they ran across any of these Tibetans, he was supposed to be able to be there to help them. The commander is basically lied to about everything that he's walking into. He's told that the people in Tibet are friendly and they want him there, but if he did run across anybody that was going to be an enemy to him, don't worry about it because all they had was bows and arrows. Now, Pearl Buck uses some of her writing in here to do some foreshadowing, like on page 100. When the men are told of this mission that they're going about to do, all the men shudder and they become afraid, and you can almost feel the fear in the men when they think about what they're going into. Then on the next page, as the commander is setting out to go on the march, he is warned by the Chinese officer in charge of that post there. He says, "You must be watchful of the Tibetans. They hide in the valleys. They are the color of the gray rock. You must shoot any Tibetan you see and shoot at sight. They are clever and cruel." After the first day of the marching, the men are tired, yet there's no food to be had. Another one of his things he was told was that you could live off the land. But once they got out there and started marching, there was virtually nothing to be had to eat. They are also tired because when they left the post, they could not locate enough horses or mules or just basically beasts of burden. So the men had to split up all the supplies and carry it on their backs. Now they had to go on like this for 5 days because it was going to take that long to march to the post. On the sixth and final day, the commissar, who is weak in body and everything, is frail, and he can't go on anymore, and he demands to have his own horse to ride. The commander is reluctant to do this, but he's fearful that if he allows the commissar to die, he'll be held accountable for his murder. So he lets him have the horse. Now, upon seeing this, there's 2 Tibetan guides, and when they see the commissar get the horse, they want one of their own. And they're not going to go any further until they get it. So the commander has to relent and give them the horses also. Once again, the cargo carried by these 3 horses is distributed upon the men to make it worse for them. They're forced to hike up through this narrow inclined cliff where these freezing winds are battering the troops even more. And then when they get through that, they spill out into this gully that's surrounded by these cliffs. It's a perfect place for an ambush, and the commander wants to get out of there. However, the commissar is exhausted, and he cannot go any further, and he demands that they stop. It's not very soon after that that some Tibetans drive on them, starting to take some more of their horses away from them. In a move of desperation, the commander requests a meeting, and so he sends his long life friend to with a message to get this meeting set up. Well, as he goes up to get the meeting set up, he's cut down in a hail of bullets, and he's even decapitated. However, the meeting is agreed to. The meeting, unfortunately, is a disaster, as the commissar, when he's talking to these people, launches into one of his tirades. Like on page 112, he says, "We men of Han have saved you from the slavery of the Western imperialists. Deny it and you will die. Your ancestors were our vassals. Your land is our land. We will allow you to live upon it by the mercy of our great Mao Tse-tung, but not until we have driven away the imperialists from the West. For this you should be grateful. You should welcome us." And now, mind you, they're surrounded, and it's a bad position for them to be in, but he promises them, "You will die tonight." Finally, having put up with all he could with the commissar, the commander flies into a fit of rage, and he himself kills the commissar. And then the men prepare to die. Now, the biggest irony, of course, is that this mission is the commander's reward for his loyal service and his brave acts that he's done over the last 15 years. And also, perhaps there's a subtle message in here to the reader about maybe the rewards of communism. Now, I picked out a few of the memorable quotations that I think kind of illustrate Pearl Buck's writing style a little bit. The first one is on page 105, and it describes the men as they're going through this inclined cliff with the wind beating them up. What he did not count upon the wind. He had heard of the winds of Tibet, those cruel gales, the icy breath of the mountains. Now halfway up the path, in mid-afternoon, he heard a strange moaning roar. The sky, clear since morning, was suddenly black, and out from the dragon shapes of the and out from the dragon shapes of the whirling clouds there burst a wind so fierce, so frozen with needles of ice, that it fell upon him and his men like a solid wave of searing cold. He saw his men fall to the ground, struggling with their packs, and he saved himself only by clinging to an arm of a rock and hiding his face. Then, fearing to lose his guides, he lifted his head and saw the 2 Tibetans riding ahead, their shawls across their face, their fur hats pulled down. The commissar rolled behind, bent over the saddle, and shortly he falls off of it. That's where he says, "We're stopping here tonight." Okay, also on page 110, this is right after his friend Cao Li is killed. It says, the commander forgot where he was. He saw only Cao Li's headless body. He ran up the path, and with his foot he caught his head as it rolled down the sloping cliff. Cao Li's face looked up at him, his eyes startled in sudden death, and he gazed down at the face caught by his foot. The commander remembered Cao as a child in his village, his faithful follower from the days when he had flown kites together until this day. To Cao, he had been always a hero. He felt a deep pain in his breast and the pain in his throat, and he swelled into a sob. Once again, his emotional side's coming out of it. Now, as far as critical reviews go for this story, there's really nothing for the story, but they were in for the book as a whole. First one is by Richard Sullivan. And he says, unhappily, 14 Stories is a blurry book, yet the writing is absolutely correct. It has no ambiguities in it. Its grammar is flawless and its rhetoric is noticeable. Verbally, though, it is, let us say, unexciting. Everything always gets nicely, neatly, tidily resolved in these passages. For readers who want superficial tidings of goodwill, 14 Stories will seem a reachy book. And last one I have is also, it's from the Christian Science Monitor. It says, the characters are not victims of their own conceptions and actions, their mistakes, or those of others. They are victims of inexorable circumstances for which, for them, there is no escape. And that really clearly falls in the category of the poor commander and his troops. And that's my presentation.
Let me see what those quotes.
Oh, the reviews?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Cupp, for your inviting presentation, for your review of the critics. The critic who says that 14 Stories is blurry and unexciting, I couldn't agree less with, because your story itself, The Commander and the Commissar, is a brilliantly told story of the realities of political power and the frustration of political corruption. Now we're going to move on, and Miss Smith, Stacy Smith, is going to deal with another story, Begin to Live, which deals with the return of a soldier from the wars. Miss Smith.
As Dr. Rothman already pointed out, Begin to Live by Pearl Buck is a very psychological story about a young man's return home from World War II. The major characters in the story are Tim, Kit, and Tim's father. Tim is the gentleman who's returning home from World War II. He was a bomber pilot in the war, and in the process of one of his missions, he's lost an arm. He returns home to his girlfriend, Kit, who is very loving and devoted. She's been one of the most devoted girlfriends that the town's ever seen. They say she's more devoted than most of the wives of the men that are gone. When he comes home, she cries out of happiness and wants to get married. And she doesn't openly lament the loss of Tim's arm, which I find really interesting. She never really mentions it even. Tim's father is also a very important character in the story, which is very interesting because he was never an important character in Tim's life prior to leaving for the war. It even says in the book, or in the story, he and his father had never been especially close. His father was a quiet man, hard-working, a partner in a law firm, at home pleasantly submissive to the family. He had never thought much about his father. Well, that right there kind of shows that he has thought about his father. He's just never really put any thought into it. He returns home from the war by train. He's had a long train ride to think about the excitement of coming home, but he realizes once he gets there that he's absolutely terrified to return to his old life and see all these people that he hasn't seen in 2 years. When he gets off the train, he sees his sister Mary for the first time, and he meets her fiancé and finds that her fiancé is anxious to join the war effort and go to battle himself. And all Tim can say is, swell. And he sees the boy lifting into the night, wondering if he would ever come back. He'd have to tell him what? How could you tell another living soul what it was like? So already he's having trouble dealing with what he's been through. now that he's home. When he enters his house again, he thinks that it's unchanged and realizes that everything there is the same, but he's got such a different view of the house now. He saw it as he'd never seen it before because he'd seen so many in Tennessee, in Georgia, in Arizona, in England, in Normandy, and the roofs of houses in Germany under his bomber. So he equates his house with all these other houses all over the United States, but then he realizes that they're just like all the houses everywhere, even the ones that he himself has destroyed. And I think that he really sums up his feelings very poignantly when he says, "I feel the way I used to when I got off the roller coaster at the fair." So he's really in a lot of emotional turmoil right now. When he and Kit are finally left alone for the first time since they've been home, he's thrilled to be with her again. He's very happy to see her again, and he wants to tell her everything, but he has this sense of hesitation, of being stopped, he calls it. And he knows what he wants to tell her about all his experiences, and he wants to sum them up in one magical word, but he also knows that this is impossible. And this is when he really begins his emotional tug-of-war with himself that he has throughout this entire story. And this is a quote directly out of the story. "It wasn't important to him what he had done or even what had happened. It seemed to him now that what had happened in these 2 years was mechanical and meaningless, but all his feelings were important. The way he felt, for example, when he was in the sky. Being in the sky so much made a man solitary. The earth rounded under him, separate and distant. He left the world and entered the universe. And the moment when out of the sky the enemy bullet had pierced his flesh, the unexpectedness of it, nothing in sight, no one, and yet death was hiding in the clouds." So he's really having a lot of trouble dealing with what has happened to him. And what I find really interesting in here is that he says that it was mechanical and meaningless, but then right away he says it was very emotional for him. All his feelings were very important. And he's trying to deny his feelings even to himself and make it seem like it was just mechanical. When he finally eats his first meal at home with his family, they have the celebratory first meal, and his mother's been saving up meal tickets for it and everything. And she's cooked the roast rare because she remembers that that's his favorite, that's how he likes it, and he doesn't have the heart to tell her that now he can't eat rare meat. Now he eats his meat well done because he can't stand to see the sight of the bloody meat. And his father reminds him that he too once returned home from a war. He was in World War I. And Tim is absolutely shocked because he had forgotten that there had ever been another war. He's so wrapped up in himself that he can't believe that this has ever happened to anyone else, that anyone else has ever been through it. When he gets upstairs to change clothes, he's grown out of all his old clothes. And that's kind of convenient for him because he's more comfortable in his uniform anyway. And this is very symbolic because he's grown out of his old life. It's not just his old clothes. And what the uniform represents, the entire military way of life, is what he's comfortable with now because he's been involved in it for 2 traumatic years. When he sees all the people that he hasn't seen in years, he's very uncomfortable with them. And he starts really wondering if something's wrong with him. And he reaffirms to himself that the people with whom he's been raised are the same while he has changed. But he doesn't believe that this is the problem that he's having with facing them. So he decides to tell Kit his troubles so that maybe she can help him figure out his problem, which he never does, as we see later in the story. When Kit becomes quiet and tearful, he asks her why she's crying, and she answers simply and truthfully that she's crying because she is happy. And this passage really illustrates the bias of the narrator towards Tim. It's a third-person narrator, but it's very limited to Tim because Kit's answer isn't simple and it's not truthful. She's crying for a lot of reasons. She's just not crying because she's happy. That's part of it, but she's crying because this is not the man that left her, and they're not picking up the way that she thought they would. Tim decides that his first duty, finally, is to look for a job, and he begins discussing it with his father, who recommends that he might take up flying. And Tim responds, "God, no," although he had not thought of it until this moment. Could he ever have taken up a plane without remembering the times he had gone on his missions of death? And the fact that Pearl Buck chose to use his missions of death, they weren't just missions of death. He takes them very personally, and he really identifies with what he's done, with the destruction that he's caused. When he goes down to apply for a job at his old employer, he realizes that his employer is wondering about his arm, and he realizes that he can feel that that person is wondering about his arm. And that's really amazing to him, that he can feel what other people are thinking. Well, most people can feel what other people are thinking. It's just that he's been trying not to for so long that he had forgotten that he knew how. And he finally buys new clothes and retires his uniform, but it was though he were burying something. And once again, that's the death imagery. When his father requests to see him in his office, it's under the pretense of discussing monetary issues. He's going to talk to him about legal issues surrounding his job and things of that sort, but he realizes that Tim is completely ignoring him and that he's still hearing the marching of feet and things of that sort. And he starts to talk to him about the war, and he puts into words that everything that Tim feels, and says that the greatest problem that war leaves in a man is how to recapture reality, because war is unreal. And Tim violently argues with this and says, no, war is horribly real. War is the only thing that's real. And his father tries to teach him that if he represses all of this, that eventually he'll realize that the rest of life is what's real. And Tim asks his father how he told his mother about all the horrible things that went on in World War I, because he doesn't know how to tell Kit. And Tim's father responds that he didn't ever tell his mother, and if Tim really loves Kit, he won't ever tell her either, because she'll never be able to understand what he's been through. On his father's advice, Tim finally goes ahead and asks Kit to marry him, because he knows that he's got to restart his life. He very emotionlessly asks her with a very dry mouth, and he stood holding her hand, his cheek pressing her hair. In the silence, while they stood together, while he waited, he felt something begin to beat in his breast, faintly, uncertainly. Was it his heart? And this is the last line of the story, and it really sums up Tim's emotional state through this whole story. And Pearl Buck puts in there while he waited. And that's very interesting, because what is he waiting for? Kit already said yes. He already knows that Kit's going to be very excited to marry him. He's waiting to start feeling emotion again. He's waiting to feel his heart beat. There are some key symbols in the story. The most interesting one that I found was that all the women in the novel are portrayed as Madonna figures. Of course, the mother is the eternal mother. He can't picture her as anything but his mother. His sister's name is Mary. And when he gets off the train and sees Kit for the first time, he says that she stood surrounded by his family like a Madonna in the frame. So it very blatantly points out that she is a Madonna figure in this story. And of course, there's the roast and the raw flesh. Beginning to live is something different for everybody in the story. For Kit, beginning to live is picking up where she and Tim left off, getting married, buying a little house in town together. For Kit, it's something different. For Tim, it's something different. He wants to suppress and overcome the tragedies that he's endured and the pain that he's inflicted on people. And although they seem very different, they both have the same point. They want to put behind them the past 2 years of their lives. And this doesn't say anything negative about Kit, that she wants to do it the way she is. Actually, she's being very strong. Kit is Tim's emotional stability through this whole thing. We don't really see much emotion in Kit because, as I said before, the narrator is very limited to Tim's point of view, and Tim's not really understanding what Kit's going through. He's so wrapped up in his own emotions that he has no comprehension of what Kit's going through. And finally, I included a quote out of the story that I think really sums up what Pearl Buck thinks about the entire war. But what had he learned, except how to hit a target with a bomb? It had been no easier to go up the 50th time than it had the first. You didn't really learn anything in war. It got worse, not better. That's why so many of the fellows took to getting half drunk. But you couldn't drink if you were going up in the air. You had to face death cold sober. Yet it wasn't his own death he had found the hardest to face. It was having to let death loose on a lot of other human beings. And so, in case anybody found the rest of the story the least bit subtle about Pearl Buck's views, this really wraps up her entire, what she's trying to get across about the war that he's lived through. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Smith. Tim's reality is the realization that when he drops these bombs, some will land on the targets designed, but some will miss. And he speaks about watching buildings explode open and human beings running from them who weren't the target. That's one of the realities of war that people don't care to admit. That in spite of your careful efforts, innocent people will be hurt. Tim's fear of going up each time on the plane, each mission, doesn't get any easier. It becomes more difficult. And the tension he feels is never relieved, even though mission after mission he repeats the same actions. Because one of the questions is who is going to die on the ground. The other question is who is going to return. He's faced, of course, with the discovery that his father has been through this as well in World War I. But he was involved in hand-to-hand bayonet combat. And he had plunged that bayonet into people's bodies and had pulled it out and had done it over and over and looked at the surprised look on the faces and the angry look on the faces of the people whom he killed while he survived. And so they have this relationship, and Miss Smith was right. Their relationship was tenuous at first. But here they form a bond that they understand that can really be revealed to other people. Telling the story, of course, is Pearl Buck's way of treating these terrible events of war, which are not reconciled by either victory or by peace or by survival. People will die. And you even pick up the newspapers and read about someone at a training camp who has been killed. Someone who left his job during the summer, went to camp for a couple of weeks, thought it would be relatively safe, but when you're dealing with armaments, when you're dealing with weapons, when you're dealing with rolling vehicles, when you're dealing with the training, there are going to be deaths, and there is much a part of it as actual combat and warfare. Pearl Buck heard the stories of the Boxer Rebellion. She lived through the siege of Nanking. She understood people dying, and she understood people surviving. And while the story ends happily, perhaps the Madonna figure is a rather, in fact it is an incisive commentary, and the Madonnas will survive. But the pain they take with them and the people whom they save and the people whom they nurture are in grief and in pain, in suffering, people who are nurtured to bring hope to the world, in some cases to help people who themselves are in suffering. The story seems simple. It's a little bit more complex than that. And I just want to take one more moment to discuss a writing feature of Pearl Buck's works. There are three types of literature that Pearl Buck discusses in her Nobel Prize speech. She says there is the official literature of the scholar, bureaucratic, ensconced in the Confucian tradition. Its purpose is utilitarian. Its purpose is to state a moral or to express a religious commentary. And she knows that tradition, but she is not writing in that tradition. The tradition is called Wenli. It's a classical language, and it has highly elusive phrasing and a lot of cliches. And she was actually asked to eliminate cliches from English translations because they didn't sound good in the English. But that would be the high style. She writes more in the vernacular literature. She writes in a common style. It's not a literary form that has favor amongst the elite Chinese, nor among Chinese poets. It is a fast-moving action with simple vocabulary and a simple style. People complain that, in fact, her later works were too simplistic and more propagandistic, but that simple style lends to that purpose. The third style, which she doesn't get into, but which has a place in her stories as people tell each other stories, is the oral literature. This is the people's literature. This is the unwritten literature. And in 1959, we know there were 33 storytellers in Yangzhou. One specialized in the saga of Wu Song, the hero of the Xiuqian, with 108 separate people described in it. And it required 75 two-hour sessions to narrate. Well, she does get into a lot of characters. She does get into interesting characters. And to some extent, she is telling us a story, and she's in this lower tradition, and she recalls it. The style is fast-moving action. It's a simple style and vocabulary which does not delay the action. It moves the action along. And the character springs from character, that is, it springs from the way people talk and the dialogue they entertain. So when you talk about the simple style of Pearl Buck, just remember that she's writing out of a tradition, and she has explained it in a Nobel speech, of 3 types of literature being expressed by the Chinese people, and she looks at herself as being in the middle style. Now we're going to move on to 2 final stories, and Laura Nath is going to introduce us to a very interesting child actress, Melissa, and Carol Turner will conclude with a story in its own way quite memorable. First, Miss Nath, Melissa.
This story is a lot different from the past 2 stories about history and soldiers and armies, and it's a much lighter story. I'd like to start with an introduction. It's the outline for the presentation. Is it? There it is. First, I'd like to introduce the story and do some information on Pearl Buck and talk about the controversy that surrounds the award of the Nobel Prize. Not everyone was in agreement when she was awarded the prize. And I'd like to further talk about the style and the language, and then go right into the story of Melissa and the characters, talk about the main characters and the summary of major events, then move on to the analysis of the work, the specific analysis, talk about some of the memorable quotes, and move to the rhetorical devices and the critical articles that talk about her work. On to the next. Okay, she did receive the prize in 1938, and she was the first American woman to receive the award, and she was only the 3rd American to win the award. She was 69 years old when these stories were published, and some of the history that surrounds the time of the work that I thought was important was that Betty Friedan was publishing The Feminine Mystique, and that was a work all about housewives being dissatisfied with staying at home. It's crooked. Better? they were dissatisfied with staying at home, and she was really talking about the women getting out into the workforce and doing other things and contributing to society. So that's what she was facing at the time this came out. Okay, I have some about the controversy. There were some other authors that people thought would be better suited for the award. Among these were Theodore Dreiser, Willa Cather, T.S. Eliot, and Ernest Hemingway, and these were all surprised. They were all surprised when none of these were chosen. And some of the reasons that she was chosen was that Sweden had shown an interest in family epics, especially those that took place in unfamiliar places, and Pearl Buck definitely does that. She also appeals to the people by writing about poverty and the uncertainty that characterized the time of the Great Depression. Her novel, The Good Earth, was a rags to riches story, and it talked about the characters in China, and it parallels the idea that we have in the United States, that anyone can become president of the United States. It talks about the common man, and we can all strive to improve ourselves and better ourselves. Here's some characteristics of her style and language. And like Dr. Rothman said, she has uncomplicated plot and simple everyday language. Her vocabulary is very easy to understand, makes the story move along very quickly. The themes are very realistic. She has true-to-life stories with characters that are easy to relate to. They can be anyone on the street. They can be you. They're often called flat or ordinary, but the people who nominated her for the Nobel Prize disagreed with that. She has a humanistic quality. She's very compassionate towards the characters. She's very objective about when she's talking about the characters. She gets it from both sides. She talks about the characters from both points of view so that you get both sides. Okay, now we'll move into the actual story of Melissa. There are three main characters. Melissa is the 10-year-old actress in a Broadway play. We don't find out where the story is set, but we can assume it's a big city, probably New York. Her mother has left to marry an Englishman. Her mother was an actress as well. And the story is told from the little girl's perspective, which is unusual since Pearl Buck is 69 when she writes this. Aunt Mary is the 25-year-old guardian of Melissa, and she's a secretary, and she has vowed never to fall in love because of what Melissa's mother has done and run away and left her family. And she's afraid of love, and she's afraid of doing the same types of things as Melissa's mother. So she's just sworn she's not going to love ever at all. Barney Keene is the young director of the play that Melissa's in, and he falls in love with Aunt Mary despite her promise to never fall in love. And he needs Melissa's help in persuading Aunt Mary to fall in love with him. Here's a summary of some of the major events. The story begins with a dialogue between Melissa and Mary, and Melissa's left alone in the theater all by herself, and she has a conversation with the young director, and this is where we find out that her father is dead, and we find out about the mother leaving, and we learn about Aunt Mary. Later that evening, when Melissa comes home, Aunt Mary becomes concerned because Melissa's talking about the star making up love to the director. So she becomes a little concerned, and she decides to stay with Melissa the next day to see what these people are talking about and maybe protect her from some of the things she shouldn't be hearing. The director and the Aunt Mary are introduced, and Melissa's comforted to have Aunt Mary there, even though she was embarrassed at first to have her there. She thinks it would be wonderful to have an Aunt Mary sort of mother who could stay home, stay with her, and have lunch with her like some of the other stage mothers do. And Aunt Mary later remarks about Mr. Keene's manners, and this is the first indication that we have that maybe she's changing her mind a little bit here, that she might be liking Mr. Keene. Aunt Mary admits to Melissa that she's upset, but Melissa thinks maybe it's that Aunt Mary is in love with Mr. Keene, and that's what's distracting her a little bit. But Aunt Mary denies it, but Melissa says she knows what happens in the theater when two people are brought together, and I'd like to read from the story. Because some of her wording is pretty amazing for a 10-year-old. It says, but she knew very well after that. She had watched too many stars on the stage, making love to the leading men, to the young directors. She knew that all one had to do with a young and pretty woman and a young and handsome man was to bring them together in a theater, especially an empty theater, where you could sit in the dark alone and watch a love story shaped before your eyes into a play. Young as she was, she knew, and the next morning she clung to her aunt's hand. So she's already had some experience in the theater. She knows what can happen in the theater. She's watched her mom fall in love. So she's thinking that maybe Aunt Mary's going to do the same thing, and she's probably a little scared, but a little bit excited too, because she has a desire for a family. Melissa pretends to feel ill the next day so that Mary will stay with her for the next day. And Mr. Keene wants Mary to call him Barney, but she replies that she doesn't know him. And then he counters with, "I've always known you, Mary," which is a nice line. And that line starts a new theme in the story, and it shifts. Oops. The story shifts and a new play is introduced. And this is a play that takes place in Melissa's mind. And from now on, the story is separated into acts, which is parallel to the play that Melissa is in. So the first act starts with Aunt Mary, who is distracted, and the narrator describes the scene as the fact that she was eating and smiling and saying nothing, and that was all right. It was only the end of the first act. So that's how we know that that's the first act. Then we come to Act 2, and Melissa comments that the second act is really long, and it has to be revised by Melissa and Mr. Keene. And Mr. Keene asks for help. He wants to know what sort of thing is Aunt Mary looking for. And Melissa has to explain to him that she doesn't want to be someone with nothing left in a play. She wants to be real. So then there's an intermission, and while Melissa waits for the third act, that's where she dances in the aisles of the theater, and she's just waiting for the next act as if it's a real play. Then we start with the third act, and during this is when Melissa tells Mary, "You're in love with him, not play love, real love." So Melissa pleads with her aunt to marry him, and then Act 4, you would think would be the wedding of Mary and Barney, but this act never is presented in the story. So Pearl Buck leaves us to wonder what happens to the two characters. Do they ever get together? Do they marry or not? So we're left to draw our own conclusions. And there are several themes that are going on in the story. The first one is reality versus acting. And from just some of the things that I've read, you can already tell the use of the words reality and play. And these go on constantly throughout the story. You have Aunt Mary who tells Melissa, "Stop acting." And then you have Melissa telling Aunt Mary about the two people in the play that she's in. It's play love. And then later you have the real play. Melissa saying she wants to be real. So there's this constant back and forth between playing and reeling and trying to distinguish between the two worlds, the real world that they're living in, and then the play world that they're on stage. There's also the conflict going on with Melissa between childhood and adulthood. She's in this adult world, yet she's still a 10-year-old child. And at some point, she does seem like a child. There's a bit of her innocence when she asks, "Do you like my dress?" It's something a little child would say. She's fearful at times. She's afraid of the chandelier falling on her and killing her. She's dependent. She wishes that her Aunt Mary would stay and be mother-like to her. And then she pouts later when Aunt Mary scolds her. She says, "You're being cross with me," and you can almost see her pouting. So she does have childlike qualities. But at the same time, she's also very adult. I don't know if you can see all of that one. You can see the first one. She's already made up her mind that she's going to, there we go. She's going to be an actress. And she even tells the director, "I'm an actress, so why would I want to be a secretary?" She's watching her weight and knows that actresses can never be fat, and not many 10-year-old girls are thinking about that. She doesn't want the aunt to stay at first and thinks that actresses can take care of themselves. She's very independent already at 10 years old. And she uses some adult words. She says about the director, "I've fallen in love with him as a father, Aunt Mary, not as a lover." Some more themes. Okay, the next theme is Aunt Mary's conflict between love and solitude. And you hear her constantly denying that she'll ever fall in love. "I'll never let myself in for love, never." She's very emphatic. And she says, "I've sworn to myself I will not marry a theater man." And she just goes on and on. Every time Melissa says, "You might be in love with him, you might be in love," she says no. So, and then later she talks about that destiny lies within ourselves. She's talking with the director, and he's brought out that we live our own lives and we make our own choices, and that our lives are not predetermined. And she's recognizing it at this point. She says, people who can live their lives don't destroy themselves. In a matter of speaking, I destroy myself. So she has come to the she's recognizing in herself what she's doing. I also found interesting that the lines that Melissa speaks in the play, they address the issue of the mother figure and the mother's love, and they also depict Melissa's character looking for a father. And these lines in the play are paralleling the questions that are on Melissa's mind in reality. So we have that back and forth with the play and the real again. So it's a simple story, but it does have some complex themes that are going on at the same time. I had 4 memorable quotes. Most of them I've read. Was when Melissa said she's an actress, why would she want to be a secretary? She just already knows what she's going to do. And she was talking about the leading lady in the play, and she already knows how to be an actress. And she says she thinks about herself all the time and not about the part. A real actress doesn't think about herself. So she already knows how to be an actress, and this other leading lady doesn't know how to do it the way she is. And then we have the next one. Then at the very end is where she's pleading Aunt Mary to marry the director. She says, please, Aunt Mary, please do marry him. I love him so much too. As a father, I mean, the way I love you as a mother. So we see that she's trying to piece these people in her life together as a family because she's lacking a family, and she's trying to bind them together. Okay. I found several rhetorical devices that were used in the story. The first one was logic, in the way that the systematic study of the principles by which conclusions are drawn from a formulation of observations or assertions. So there's an argument here that when there was a good first act, there would certainly be a play. Everyone knows that. So they're already assuming that because there was a first act, the play is going to keep going. But then we see that there wasn't a fourth act. We didn't find out what happened at the end of the play. There's another device called protesting too much. It involves not only denial, but repeating that denial. And we see this constantly with Aunt Mary denying that she's ever going to fall in love. And then at the end, we see that she might be. There were several similes in the story. The first one that I found was the skirt is like the whirl of flower petals. You're rather like a flower. So the director's comparing Melissa to a flower with her skirt. And then in the intermission, she danced in the empty aisles, as light upon her feet as a hummingbird upon its wings. So that gives a nice visual image there. And finally, I found 2 critical articles. I found one that was negative and one that was positive. The negative one is by Paul A. Doyle, and it says, a growing sentimentalism also makes itself felt more and more in her later writing, and this attitude is detrimental to the highest artistry. And several people disagree with this and feel that her writing is very real still at the end, and still it's still impressionable. The second one is by Warren French and Walter Kidd, and it's the American winners of the Nobel Literary Prize. And it's a positive remark. And it says, in a remarkable, easy, and lucid prose style, she discussed everything from the war between men and women to actual war, from orphans to atom bombs. So we've already gone from the stories before about the war to this story about Melissa. And she goes back and forth between them very well. That's all I have.
Thank you, Ms. Nath. Melissa is a very, very complex story. It looks simple, but the psychology of the child and the mobility of the aunt, the relationships that develop between the aunt and the director, and Melissa desiring to have a mother, though she's an abandoned child, suggests Pearl Buck's interest in the plight of children in this world, and tells us that not only are Asian Americans abandoned, children of black and white black soldiers and white soldiers, and relationships with those of other races, not only are they abandoned, but children themselves are abandoned by their very families. And so if we discuss the family as a structuralist concept, we can well understand why Pearl Buck stories are so absorbing. By the way, this book, 14 Stories, is very difficult to obtain. It's been out of print for many years, and it isn't in most of the libraries in Houston, at least the public libraries or Rice or the University of Houston Library. We have obtained special permission to reproduce this text, and for those of you who don't yet have it, you can find it in the Copy Center of the University Center, which is open during the week from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. So if you need the text, don't have it, it is available in a Xerox format in the Copy Center of the University Center, where we obtain permission to, where permission has been obtained to reproduce it. We also have, combined with that, Isaac Singer's story, Blood, which you wouldn't otherwise obtain for this course, except in the Copy Center. So please check those two stories out. Check out the stories in 14 Stories by Pearl Buck, and check out Singer's Blood, and you can obtain these stories in the Copy Center. When you're dealing with the stories of Pearl Buck, you're dealing with, as Miss Nath said, contemporary events. And contemporary events of the most profound sort. Pearl Buck did not live to see the collapse of communism in the Soviet Union. She did not live to see the advent of capitalism and the restructuring of the bureaucracy in China. This very week we read where hundreds of thousands of bureaucratic jobs are going to be lopped off the system to get rid of the fat in communism and to streamline it for capitalistic competition. So a revolution is going on right now, but a quiet one. One that's reflected perhaps more in the stock market than on the battlefield. We don't know how Tibet is going to play itself out yet, but we know that that has yet to be settled. We're going to end today's discussion of Pearl Buck's works. And I think you found this a unique writer and one worth spending time with. We're going to conclude now with Miss Carol Turner discussing Death and Dawn.
In the very title of this story, Death and the Dawn, we already see Pearl Buck beginning to use contrasting ideas. She converges these ideas and lives to form complete images. She also, throughout this story, talks about different phases of life and how they're all part of one continuum. Some of the things you see, the symbolism and imagery, such as night, the stories occurring in the night, the darkness of this boy's life, also the dying man. We also see dawn as beginning of new life for the boy. The dawn is also representative of the new life for the old man after he dies, eternal life. There's also a lot of contrast, such as old age and youth, and the loneliness and family. In the very opening dialogue of this story, the nurse says, "There's no place to put him, doctor," which is descriptive of this boy's entire life up to this point. So they go ahead and decide to put him in the room with this dying old man, Mr. McLeod. The doctor says it'll be okay because the boy is going to sleep through the night. Anyway, let's look at the nurse's impression of the boy. She says, "If ever he wakes," the nurse thought, looking at the kid, "he was the reckless type, blonde hair worn too long, sharp, thin face, long, thin body, thin to the bone, the kind that was always getting smashed up in car accidents. Under the heavy white bandages, the young face was somber. Nobody knew who he was, and the car was stolen. This story was probably written in the later 50s, which was around the time that, if you remember, well, some of you may remember, 1955, James Dean, Rebel Without a Cause. And that's what this little character in the story reminds me of, is this type of boy. She uses a rhetorical device here in the long, the sharp, thin face, the long, thin body, thin to the bone. The reader's left with no doubt that this is a skinny boy, and I'll refer to that later in the story. Just remember that he's a skinny boy. We go on and we meet some of the characters. Mrs. McLeod is the wife here of the dying man. She's a strong woman, has a strong faith in life hereafter. And her strength of character and deep faith becomes apparent in the way that she deals with this death of her husband. She calls up to the hospital in the middle of the night and asks the nurse to go and check on her husband. The nurse goes into the room, and it's interesting here. She says the boy's breathing was a little better, but she did not look at him. Mr. McLeod was lying perfectly still. She was not sure about him. Was he breathing, this old man? I found it kind of interesting that as his breathing, the boy's breathing was getting better, the old man's breathing was worsening. One life is fading, and we're going to see that this boy's life is beginning to flourish throughout the story. We're introduced next in the story to the McLeod family, and we can see in these paragraphs her strength and also the grief of the children and what a close family this is. When she comes into the room, they're coming to say their final goodbyes at the bedside of this old man. She was composed. This is Mrs. McLeod, an aging figure, short but strong, her face controlled. Only Miss Martin, the nurse, noticed that her small, compact hands were trembling as she took off her hat. And then the families described here. They came in. The son, a tall young man, his plain face anguished. His wife, a slender blonde woman who was crying behind her handkerchief. And the daughter, pretty and young and dark like her father. Miss Martin knew them all, George, Ruth, and Mary. Anyway, it goes on to say what a close family they were and how they had come every day to visit their father. The boy seems kind of peripheral to the whole story. He's just laying over here in this other bed, and as this family is in here. And the son asks, what about that fellow, nodding toward the other bed? He's unconscious, Miss Martin said. There's no other place to put him. Once again, he's just got no place here. The hospital's full, you can just forget him. I don't think she's meaning to be cruel here. It's just that he's not part of this drama that's being played out in this family. I kind of interject a little deep thought I had here about the story, about just by a simple twist of fate, this boy ended up in the room with this family, and the family indeed pays no attention to him throughout the rest of the story. But you think, what impact do we have? They have a profound impact on him. So you think, what impact do we have on others of which we might never be aware? Or conversely, you can look at it from the boy's point of view. Like if we are observant of things happening around us, what can we learn about life, like this boy learned? The family comes on in and they talk of inconsequential matters, things like cherry trees blooming, baking pies, past Christmases. They're reliving memories that are only important to them, but their chatter begins to cut into the boy's subconscious thoughts. And I like the way Buck describes his gradual awakening here, like in his dark little mind here. Deep in the caverns of his brain, he heard voices echoing. Anyway, the family continues to reminisce, and as they do, we learn more about the old man's character, even though, of course, he has very few lines in the story as he's dying here. But we find out he was a good father, he was a good listener, he was a good provider for the family. He's also facing death with the knowledge that he had lived a good life. Well, as the boy realizes this and he's more awake now, he starts to examine his own life to see why he's ended up where he is. It says in the story, where had he been going when he hit the truck? Nowhere, nowhere at all. He just couldn't stand it anymore. He was running away from nobody, from nowhere to nowhere, loafing around the streets because nobody cared what he did. He couldn't remember anybody who had ever cared. Pearl Buck follows up this boy's rather hopeless thoughts here with some more kind of strong imagery that she uses throughout this story. The family goes on and starts talking about the Easter lily that they've got that's in bloom with 6 flowers on it. The Easter being another underlying theme in here of resurrection, new life, the continuance of life. I also kind of wondered if the lily with more blooms on it than it's ever had before isn't a reference to the boy's life blossoming, this new life of the boy that's we're going to see coming out here. Mary also, when she says her final goodbye to her father, uses the phrase that she'll see him in the bright, bright morning. Obviously, they're not going to see their father again. This is his last night and he's dying. I think she's referring to seeing him in life after death. This family has a strong religious, a strong faith in eternal life, and I think that's what she's referring to there. The boy, after listening to them here, it says that he felt like crying, but not about them. This may seem kind of like he's self-centered at first when you first read that, but after you really think about it, there's a lot more sadness in his empty life than in the full life of this dying old man. He felt like crying about himself because he had never had a father, because his mother had died when he was little, because he had no family. That was the trouble with him. He had no family. The children leave and everything, and the mother stays there with the old man, and the boy is listening as the wife is remembering with her husband how they met and how he proposed. And the old man speaks his last words here, which are just simply a good life. We see the boy becoming a little bit more empathic now for the old couple, and this leads up to one of my favorite quotations in this story. He feels like crying again, but it's a little bit more for the old man. He said, now anyone could see the old man was dying. The boy wanted to cry. He hadn't cried since he was a kid, and a big boy had hit him on the head. He didn't mind being hit. He was used to it, but not from that boy. And he had cried because he had liked to think the boy was maybe like a brother if he had had one. I thought this was really sad and telling a lot about the boy, how desperately he wanted a family. There's also the truth in there that it's the people that we care about the most that are able to hurt us the most. Anyway, the wife goes on as the boy is still laying here and listening to all this, and the man is breathing his last breath, so the woman begins to read the 23rd Psalm to him. And as she reads the part that says, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, the boy suddenly understands the meaning of these words. He's heard them before, but he's never really understood. You don't need to be afraid. That's what the old woman was saying to him. You have a family, she was saying, and we love you. In the rest of this paragraph, I've italicized the ands because I think this is a neat rhetorical device that she uses here. It's kind of a long word, polysynonym, where she uses the repetition of this coordinating word and. It creates intensity, and you get the intense, close family life that these people had. She would always remember that piece of wood, she told him, and how they stood there, he and she, long ago. And he had asked her to marry him, and she did, and they loved each other, and that's how the family was made. He and she, and then the children, and George's children, and Mary's someday. The way Buck strings all these thoughts together, you get a real picture of these two young people meeting, marrying, loving, having children, grandchildren, and then even looking on ahead to more grandchildren to come. The family is going to continue after the old man is gone, and his legacy of love is going to live on. Another thing interesting through this part is that the boy has listened to the description of the old man's proposal to the woman when they were younger. And as he pictures it in his mind, I think it's kind of cute here that he, like I said before, remember that he's skinny. He ascribes his own physical attributes to the man as a youth. He sees him as a skinny youth proposing to the girl. It never mentioned in the story that the man had been skinny. But when the boy's picturing it, he sees him as a skinny youth. And he kind of puts himself in that place and realizes that he can change his life. And this leads up to a couple other quotations that I liked. It didn't matter anymore that he had never had anyone to love him or to love. he could make his own family. And he has peace now, and he knows why he's been born. And he starts dreaming of finding a girl, asking her to marry him, having children, giving his own son the tricycle that he always wanted when he was little. He's going to have this family. And he realizes a really big truth here, that living a full and a good life takes the fear out of death. When he says this toward the end of the story, you wouldn't mind dying when you'd had everything to live for. A real quick look in my last couple of minutes here at the critics. As has been said before, she had a lot of negative criticism. This wasn't specifically about her short stories, but a lot of people felt this way. I thought this one was pretty rude. This guy said about her receiving the prize, the standards of the Academy are high, but evidently they're also flexible. Otherwise, it would be difficult to account for the recent award of the Nobel Prize in Literature to Pearl Buck. He evidently didn't think too much about her. This review here is kind of reflective of how I felt about her short stories. I really liked them. The last half here where it says, the stories illuminate Miss Buck's comprehension of the complexities of the human character, as well as her immense sympathies for those complexities. And Paul Doyle wrote a lot about her. He's kind of middle of the road here. He said she wrote too much too hastily, but he also goes on and says that she had some superior works that dealt with such topics as injustice, racial discrimination, clashing political philosophies, and conflicts between generations. She didn't just write about these things, she lived these things. She was a humanitarian, philanthropist, a civil rights activist. I don't know if this picture will show up on here. This is her with one of the kids that in the house that she founded. The thesis of most of the criticisms against her is what Paul Doyle said, the too much too hastily, but I'll let her have the last word on that. She said in an interview, one pays the price for being prolific. Heaven knows the literary establishment can't forgive me for it, nor for the fact that my books sell. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Turner, for a very illuminating discussion. Death and Dawn, an old man dying and a young boy who has not had love, learning by watching the family what love is. It occurred to me when I read that story that there's a similar theme in the story of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. If you remember, a scientist creates a monster, and then when he realizes that he has given life to this monster, it so frightens him that he flees without teaching the monster anything or teaching him how to behave in society. The monster, escaping the laboratory, finds shelter in a woodshed and sees a family talking to each other in the house, loving each other, laughing with each other, enjoying each other's company. And that's when the monster absolutely realizes the enormity of Dr. Frankenstein's crime, that he's created a figure in the world who has the capacity to love but has no one to love. And then, of course, the monster goes about to systematically kill those people whom Dr. Frankenstein is close to, in order to demonstrate to him what the horror is of being in this world without having someone to love. Now, this boy who's in this accident is in those circumstances. But instead of a scientist creating a loveless boy, society has created a loveless boy who then has to turn around again and learn what society really means in having a family whom you can love. And so to that extent, this story has the same power as portions of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Now, I'd like to conclude with one other observation. A book came out in 1996 by Peter Kahn called Pearl Buck, A Cultural Biography. It's in our library. And Professor Kahn, who's, I believe, at the Penn State University, I'm sorry, the University of Pennsylvania, I believe that's where he is, describes Pearl Buck going to the Swedish Academy in 1939 to receive the Nobel Prize for Literature. Kahn says this: the family landed in England from America. They traveled across Western Europe by steamer and train. In Copenhagen, Pearl announced that she had refused an invitation to visit Nazi Germany. Remember in 1939, Adolf Hitler had sent her an invitation, and she refused him. The episode was, of course, widely reported, as was another statement, Pearl Buck's statement that Chiang Kai-shek had lost the support of the Chinese masses and would not be able to provide the strong central government China needed to survive its war with Japan. Remarkable insights by a remarkable author.